Hi, I'm John Basalis, housing analyst and founding broker at Reelosophy Realty, where I lead our team of agents in providing data-driven real estate advice to home buyers and home sellers throughout Toronto and the Greater Toronto Area. We launched this Toronto Real Estate Summit because we're getting a lot of questions from consumers about the volatility in our economy and our housing market that was brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're going to be talking to leading economists, housing industry leaders, personal finance experts, and real estate agents to get a better understanding of what's going on in our markets today and what are some of the key things that we should be looking for in the months ahead so you can all make smarter real estate decisions. If you have more specific questions about your home buying and selling needs, please feel free to email me anytime at askjohn@movesmartly.com, and I hope you enjoy this interview. Hello everyone, John Basalis from Reelosophy Realty. So right now we have the pleasure of hearing from Preet Banerjee. Preet is the author of a fantastic personal finance book right here, Stop Overthinking Your Money. I highly recommend it. He's the founder of a fintech, MoneyGaps, which allows financial advisors to prepare a financial report card for their clients. He's a consultant to the financial services industry, a keynote speaker, was a TV host on the Oprah Winfrey Network. And on top of all of this, he's in the final stages of completing his doctorate at the Henley Business School at the University of Reading. A very busy guy, very sharp guy. And I'm looking forward to hearing some of his feedback and insights into how to navigate our personal finances during these volatile times. So without any further delay, we're going to jump right into my discussion with Preet Banerjee. Preet, thank you so much for taking the time to join us with our Toronto Real Estate Summit today. Very excited to be talking to you about some of the things that you've been talking about and have been written about in your book, which I'm really excited about. So thanks so much for taking the time today.
My pleasure, John. Anything for a friend.
So one thing, the main thing I wanted to kind of go over today is a topic you kind of talk about in your book, which we see in the background there, Stop Overthinking Your Money. And it's this idea of how to, disaster-proof our lives. And I think it's super relevant now with COVID. Obviously, a lot of people have their own, mini disasters with job losses and income losses. And I think it's important to think about, how do we mitigate those type of shocks in the future? But before we kind of jump into what we can do to mitigate future disasters, I thought it'd be good to maybe talk about, what maybe people can do to, adjust their lifestyles to kind of deal with the disaster that's in front of them now, dealing with this drop in income for a lot of people. So, what are kind of some of the tips I've seen some of your videos and you've had some great ones. I thought it'd be great to kind of share some of those ideas with today's viewers.
Yeah, absolutely. And, when I think about all the different types of situations that people are facing right now, a lot of people are anxious for a variety of reasons, whether they've already experienced job loss or dramatic loss in income, or they're scared about a potential future loss in income. There's a lot of uncertainty, and that's what breeds anxiety for a lot of people, and that by financial and mental stress is related to uncertainty. So one of the ways to reduce uncertainty is to get as much clarity as you can. You're never going to get perfect clarity, but by getting as much clarity as you can with your financial situation, it can help at least alleviate a lot of that stress so that you're in a position to make better decisions. Because when we are loaded with anxiety, it actually has this cognitive load, which can decrease the efficacy of our decision making in general. So very important to get clarity. So how do you get clarity? It is going back to basics in some regards. So some of the traditional advice about how to manage your cash flow still pertains to what you should be doing now. And that is taking stock of income, which may be variable or decreased, taking a look at your expenses, and what are the resources you can rely on. So as an example, the income part tends to be the easier part. You kind of know what's coming in the door with respect to your job. And if you had a loss in income, then you know that you're either at zero income or some partial income. So that's relatively easy to figure out. It's generally one or two income sources. Where you really want to spend some time is on the expense side. And this is where, and I'm one of those people, I do not keep a track of every single purchase every single month in perpetuity. You know, I've done the exercise to kind of stick to a set of rules that I follow with managing my expenses. But at some point, you do have to take some time to do that. And I think it's easier for people to think about doing that now because times are tough, right? Mm-hmm. And when times are tough, people resort to doing things that they otherwise would not have. So we have the behavioral drive to do these things right now. So to get stock of your expenses, you'll want to take a look at your debit card statements, your credit card statements for the last 1 or 2 or 3 months. And it's easier now than it's ever been because it's all electronic. Mm-hmm. And then you take a look at a line by line item to see what exactly all those expenses are. And you have to think about what stays, what goes right away, what can be downgraded, and what's on the chopping block next if things were to get worse. And so once you have an idea, you know, of what you could do to cut to the bone your expenses right now, because these are drastic times, now you've got your income and you've got your new sort of wartime expense level. So generally speaking, if you're in a bad situation, you're going to have a deficit position. The question is, what do you do to manage that deficit over a period of time? And this is where we start looking at the other resources we could rely on. Top of mind would be the income supports by the government. So what programs do you qualify for? Factor that into your plan. And then also things like your emergency fund, if you have one. And unfortunately, a lot of people simply do not have dedicated emergency funds. And I want to talk more about that and the psychology behind that, because that is so critically important, as we've just found out.
Yeah.
If you have one, of course, you're going to sort of tap into that as needed. Then you start to look at other things that you might have access to. If you have, in some cases, friends and family who have benefited from a really strong real estate market, they might be sitting on a lot of equity or other financial resources. If things are really tough, you're going to have to maybe think about talking to family and friends if that's an option. It's not going to be for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. Low interest sources of debt, and this is a sticky one. You don't want to get too far into this because, again, psychologically, you know, when you tap into, say, a line of credit, it's easier to spend money on a line of credit than money that is sitting in a savings account. Like there's this concept of the pain of payment and mental accounting, and we treat money differently depending on where it comes from. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes we spend credit a lot more easily than we would save funds. So you got to be careful there. This isn't the be-all, end-all solution. If you need to tap into it a little, you have to do what you have to do.
Yeah.
And then as things are worse in your situation, then you get to more and more drastic measures, such as looking at, you know, maybe starting to increase balances on credit cards. Again, horrible situation to be in the first place, but if you have to do that to get you by for the next couple months, then maybe that's what you have to do. Selling stuff, the things that you love to help you pay the bills. And then sort of at the very end of the spectrum, although I would say that some people may need to consider this earlier on in the process, talk to a licensed insolvency trustee to talk about what your options would be. I think you've probably got, you've had some conversations with people in that space before, but I talked to a number of people in that industry, and one of the things that seems clear to me is people always wait too late to even think about what their options are. So it's never too early to explore your options, and you might find that taking action sooner rather than later is going to be very beneficial for you.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think in the context of kind of cutting expenses, one tip I thought was really interesting, and I know I am a complete sucker for this, you know, when you kind of talked about going through line by line, you know, all of these subscriptions that I'm like part of that, you know, I think you mentioned they're not that expensive, you know, they're anywhere from $1 to $15 a month, but there's a lot of them. And I've got stuff that I haven't used probably in like 2 years, but I just still have there. But yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of a good example of like, you know, you could probably shed a couple $100 a month easily on useless subscriptions, probably.
Yeah, subscription creep is what
Yeah.
it's called. And that's because there's so many businesses that have transitioned to a subscription revenue model for a
Mhm.
variety of reasons, stability of revenue, and it reduces their anxiety about revenue, which gives them more clarity about their financial position in one respect. But because of that, things that you used to pay for, one time, like office productivity software. You used to pay, a couple $100 and you get, your word processor, your spreadsheet and what have you. And now if you want to buy these things, it's a monthly subscription.
Yeah.
You can buy razors. There's a razor of the month club. There's beef jerky of the month clubs. Everything is subscription now. And for the same reason that automatic savings works so well for people is the
Yeah.
same reason that subscriptions creep up on you and you don't realize how much of your expenses are basically a given because of all these subscriptions that you signed up to. And of course, there's all the sales and marketing techniques, the free trials, it's X price for the first 6 months, then after that, it's 3 times that initial introductory offer and what have you. And so we get really excited about these different things. And then just like every food, appliance, or exercise equipment that we order, that enthusiasm wears off after a couple of months.
Yeah, for sure.
But we have this inertia where we don't go and then cancel those subscriptions. So doing an audit on all your subscriptions should be something that you do every year, like in
Yeah.
January. And I've challenged a number of people to do an annual subscription audit, and it's relatively easy to find $1,000 a year. All you have to do is reduce your subscriptions by $83.33 per month. So there's a couple ways you can do that. You can outright get rid of a subscription service that you're paying for, especially if you realize that you're not using it. But you can also look at downgrading. Sometimes people think, I don't want to get rid of this, it's permanent. These are not permanent changes that you would be making. You can experiment with not trying a service for a couple months and you might find, you know what, I can actually adapt to it. So an example is, let's say Netflix. So
Yeah.
there's 3 tiers, I think, of service for Netflix. The first one gives you access to one device. Maybe it's just regular HD, and then the next tier gives you 4 people can be on and it's ultra HD or whatever. And the difference between tiers might only be $4 or whatever it is. I don't know what the exact number is. If you downgrade to the lowest one, you still get the service that you want. And if you want better resolution, just sit farther away from the TV. It looks crystal clear.
I think it's fantastic. I mean, I definitely am one of these people who has started looking at these things. Even for our own business, I realize that and I find it more for our business. It's more, it happens more because I don't really look at all those things line by line, and we have like a bookkeeper who does that stuff. So I'm not even looking at all of these things. So it's more likely for that stuff to creep up. So I think it's great even for business owners to start doing those types of things.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say the same thing. When it comes to the personal subscriptions and the business subscriptions, sometimes with the business service subscriptions, they feel like, well, this is a business expense, right? And so you think if I signed up for it in the first place, it must have been because it was worthwhile and I'm just not using it. And after a couple of times revisiting that service and realize you haven't been using it, pull the plug.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing you mentioned, I thought that was really interesting. In the context of insolvency, which I mean, I think a lot of people, obviously, it's a difficult topic to talk about and to think about. But certainly, I think that planning these things ahead of time, I agree. I think a lot of times I hear from people, and I hear from people. We're talking to Doug Hoyes as well, who specializes and works in this industry. Having a plan earlier rather than later is often helpful. In some ways, I feel like, you can see what your runway is for expenses, for income, for savings, and when the runway is going to end at some point. And I do think even just talking to get feedback from people early is a really, really great suggestion, even if they don't go down that road of insolvency or finding a solution that way. But just, I think getting some advice from a third party early is definitely a good super great strategy.
I think it's that fear of finding out what you kind of already know that keeps people from starting the process sooner rather than later. And, you could delay it. It's not going to change the underlying information. The only thing that's going to change is you're going to know exactly what those numbers are. And I'll tell you, in some cases, it's not as bad as you thought. And you won't know until you look at those numbers. So I know that, psychologically it'll be tough to sort of sit down and say, all right, let's take a look at how bad things are. But I think you can only be better off by tackling it sooner rather than later. And I use that similar. So in the startup world, you often hear about burn rates and runway when it comes to raising capital, how long it lasts. And it's basically the same thing with, what's happening with COVID-19 and people's personal finances. You had hopefully a surplus, or at the very least, a balanced budget, although a lot of people were running deficits for a while as well. But now, because of this drop in income that you might have suffered, you've got a totally different runway. It's been shortened a lot because of the drop in income. So the income supports from the government might give you a little bit more runway. But if you can really take a look at your budgeting and cut those expenses, you can make that runway even longer. So that's where you still have some control. You are somewhat out of control. You don't have the control over your income because that's usually an external factor. So you got to focus on the things that you can't control. And right now, one of the big things you can control is your expenses.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think those are some great tips for people kind of dealing with that income loss today. Now, I think it'd be good to maybe change gears a little bit and kind of start thinking about how we disaster-proof our lives for tomorrow, like for tomorrow's disaster. Now, I think before we go into that, it'd be good to kind of get your thoughts on, what you mean by disaster. I mean, what's the problem we're trying to solve? I mean, today we're dealing with one, which is potentially income loss. Like, are there other things that people don't think about? And I think that's kind of one of the things. Like, so what are some of the disasters you think about that we should be planning for in advance, to mitigate sort of the effects of them?
Great question. So years ago, I was a financial advisor and stockbroker, worked for one of the big 5 banks and met with hundreds of families. And what I noticed was the rhetoric in the media, of the industry, and even people on the street, because of the information sources, was that financial advice was all about saving for retirement, getting a better rate of return on your portfolio. So that generally means, run a surplus, take some of that surplus, invest for the future, and over 40, 50 years, you'll save enough to have a big retirement nest egg. Great. Nothing wrong with that. But that is 40 or 50 years away, right? And in between now and age 65, 70, whatever it is, life happens. And I've never seen a financial plan drawn up that doesn't have to be changed because things happen. And so it's great to think about, the best case scenario, everything goes according to plan, but lives never go according to plan. I've never met someone who hasn't had some kind of emergency. For a lot of people, it's small emergencies. And for other people, it's huge emergencies like loss of a spouse, loss of a job, loss of a business, and what we're seeing right now with the pandemic. And so it's great to have a long-term plan, but you need to make sure that you're thinking about mitigating any possible emergencies and disasters that can happen between now and that far off distant point. Because I don't know what disaster it will be, but a disaster will eventually happen to basically everyone. If you take a look at all the different types of disasters, so we talked about, job loss, health scares, cancer, heart attack, stroke, just changing family dynamics. There's so many things that can derail your finances. And this is why we need to spend a lot more attention on the disaster proofing of our lives. That's why in my book, Stop Overthinking Your Money, I've got 5 simple rules of personal financial success. Rule number 1 is disaster proof your life, because it's not sexy. And like everything that we talk about in that chapter is not sexy. Right? When people tune into business TV, they want to learn about what's happening on the stock market today, what's the best rate of return. That's the sexier stuff. The unsexy stuff, though, I think is far more important. So this covers off, I'll give you an example of one of the biggest disasters that can happen to someone, and that is becoming disabled and losing your ability to earn an income for the rest of your life. And the reason I say that is your single biggest asset in life, if you were to ask people, they'll rhyme off, oh, it's my house, it's my car, or something like that. It's generally not, especially when you're younger. Your single biggest asset that you have right now is your future earnings, right? So the average person graduating now is probably going to earn somewhere between $4 and $10 million over their lifetime. It sounds like a huge number, but if you add up all those numbers of years and even, a salary of $40, $50, $60,000, that adds up over long periods of time. And so that is your most valuable asset. And over time, you convert that as of yet unearned income into things like assets, like a house, car, and paying for vacations and all that stuff. But that's assuming that you will continue to earn it for the rest of your life. And so it seems pretty common to us that we would insure things like our homes and our cars and other assets that we have. But we should also insure our single biggest asset, which is our future career earnings. And so disability insurance is phenomenally important for that. And in my book, there's a story. So I used to host a TV show on the Oprah Winfrey Network, and it was called $1 Million Neighborhood. And the premise of the show was we had 100 families in this town, and we had to increase their collective net worth by $1 million over 10 weeks. And so I got to learn and meet and learn about a number of different families in a whole bunch of different situations. And there were two households where the head of household were disabled. And in one case, one person worked at a big Fortune 500 company. They had a disability insurance policy at work. And because of that, his household was able to pay their mortgage. The partner stayed at home to help mind the kids. And they were able to, have a decent quality of life. There was a second household, same situation in terms of the head of household having become disabled, but they didn't have disability insurance coverage. They didn't have it provided at work, and they didn't realize that they could have gotten a personal disability insurance policy. They are destined to be broke for the rest of their lives. They're living hand to mouth. They are in a rented basement apartment, and their leftover money at the end of every month is somewhere between $100 and $150 for discretionary expenses, right? So they can pay for a roof over their head, some basic food, and that's pretty much it, right? And they're destined to live like that forever. And the one difference between these two families' stories is one had disability coverage and one didn't. So it used to be that, you go back a generation or two, having great benefits at work was a given. But now there's been a shift in responsibility from the companies to the individuals. And they're saying, all right, well, we'll keep, the wages going up and up and up, but the benefits are getting less and less generous. And somehow people don't seem to really have cared that much. And so they don't realize that they don't have the same coverage, those benefits that previous generations had. There's more liability shifted to the individual. Same thing with pensions. Used to be, defined benefit pension plans. That's been shifting towards defined contribution pension plans. And so the liability and more of those expenses are being shifted to the individual. And so because of that, there are so many more people now exposed because they don't have disability insurance coverage. And so you can fill that gap by getting a private policy, but those policies have big sticker shocks for a lot of people. And the reason that those policies are expensive is because the payouts are huge because, again, it's a very big asset that you're protecting. But again, it's not a very sexy thing, but it is imperative that people have disability insurance.
Yeah, one thing you said that, really, I never really thought about this way is this idea that with disability coverage, you're effectively insuring your future income, which is your biggest asset. And it's funny you say that. I never really thought about it like that, but when you say it, it makes a lot more sense. And it's funny because even for me, I mean, I started actually looking into this after reading your book, and I should have thought about it sooner because, even I mean, we got directly impacted by this. My dad got MS when I was 23, and he stopped working. And, the only reason my family got by, because he didn't have insurance, but the only reason we got by is because he had saved a lot of money and had real estate and had the income from it. And I started managing it part time, but that's the only way. And I look back and I thought about it. It's like, some people might think, well, dual income, the one spouse can work, the other one. No, my mom became a full-time caregiver, like
Right.
24/7, right? So and you're right. I think it's one of those things. And I do wonder, I think, how much at least I'm like a natural stoic, so I like live in the worst case scenarios and try to avoid them.
Yeah.
So this stuff's like really normal for me. But I do wonder, how much of the lack of worst case scenario planning is that most people don't want to even contemplate what that worst case scenario is. You know what I mean? Like disability, loss, all of those things are things that I think most people don't want to think about. You know what I mean?
It's so abstract
Yeah.
to think about what that situation, what that living circumstance would be if that were to happen to you is very abstract. And so the weight that that concept has in our mind is very small. And I'll give you an example because this actually is very pervasive in how we make decisions about money in general and just decisions in general overall. And it's the idea of the psychological distance of the ramifications of our decisions. So I'll give you an example. So when it comes to saving for the future, a lot of people don't save enough, right? And of course, everyone knows if you walk them through, it's like, listen, you need to have money so that when you get to this age, you'll have money to spend. But that future self is psychologically very distant from us. So we don't relate to that person, right? We think more about the present. And we tend to be more present biased. So if we have $100 and someone says, hey, listen, you can spend that $100 on, going to a concert, going out to a nice restaurant, or you can save that for the future. It's much more palatable and exciting to spend that right now because we are very connected to our present selves, right? We're present biased. To think about saving for our future self, I'll get to it down the road. This is why we procrastinate and all this stuff. I'll get to it, but it's important, but not right now. This concert's really important. And so to give you an example of just how pervasive this is, there was a behavioral economist, his name is Keith Chen, and he noticed that people whose native tongue had their language had very little grammatical distinction between the present and the future were better savers. They naturally saved more money if you spoke a language where the grammar didn't delineate the future from the present very distinctly. So one of the examples he gives is that in German, if you wanted to say, tomorrow it's going to rain, in English you say, tomorrow it is going to rain.
Yeah.
In German, you say, I'm going to butcher this, morgen regnet es, which basically says, tomorrow it rains. So that grammatical structure of that language basically makes the future very similar today. Tomorrow it rains is very different than tomorrow it will rain.
Yeah.
And so when you look at all these languages, the languages that have less sort of grammatical distance between the present tense and the future tense, these people tended to save more money. And so they think of the future as being more connected to today. And it's the same thing with saving for retirement or thinking about disability. That concept of being disabled if you're not is so foreign and has such little weight in your mind that you don't put much stock into it. But I will tell you, it is one of the most important things you can have in your personal financial situation is disability insurance coverage. Yeah. And that's why it's rule number 1 in my book, Disaster Proof Your Life. And the first point in disaster proofing is disability insurance. When you look at some of the other aspects of personal finance, so people know that, or they seem to know that, when you get married and have kids, you need to think about life insurance. Yeah. Why? They're not entirely sure. They just know that they're supposed to start thinking about it. But disability insurance, you need at any point in time before you retire. Until you are self-insured,
Yeah.
you need to make sure that you have disability insurance. So that means your first job out of school, you need to be thinking about disability insurance. And it's probably more important the younger you are, because if you suffer a permanent disability, that's it. All right, you're going to have to rely on social assistance or the charity of family and friends.
Yeah. Wow. Um, So given one of the things you just talked about, sort of this idea of present bias, and we have a preference for spending today and saving. I mean, how do we go about sort of one of your other strategies, which is, saving this, we all know, is this ideal of saving this kind of 6 month cushion,
Right.
right? Um, and I guess one thing I'm curious about is, again, I think a lot of people know that they should do that,
Yeah.
but they don't, right?
Right.
And what is the sort of gap preventing them? And of course, one of it is this bias, but how do we kind of bridge that to kind of make that happen for a lot of people?
Yeah, great question. And, there are some people right now, especially if you look at higher on the income spectrum, you're less likely to have lost your job if you're earning more money, because your job is more able to be done at home through a computer. So lower end of the income spectrum tend to be more service-oriented jobs. You have to go in and physically be somewhere. Higher end of the income spectrum, less income loss, less job loss, because you can work at home. So there are actually a not insignificant number of households who are now working from home, have maintained their income, but have been stopped from spending all their discretionary income because they cannot physically go to restaurants, they cannot go to movie theaters, they can't go to concerts, they can't travel, they're not commuting. So they're actually ending up with more and more of a surplus right now. And this is an opportunity for those people to kickstart their emergency fund if they don't already have one. And the reason that I mention this is, again, people's personal financial situations are different. But if you have, say, someone who's got healthy retirement savings and some other assets, some of them still think that they don't need a dedicated emergency fund. They think, well, you know what, I have all this home equity in my home. I could tap into a home equity line of credit if something goes bad. Or I've got this, $500,000 RRSP. I could just tap into that if things get really bad. Why do I need a dedicated emergency fund, which is effectively dead money in their minds because it's earning, 1% interest, 1.5% interest? They say mathematically, it just doesn't make a lot of sense.
I'm that guy, so I'm kind of curious to hear, right? Well, I'm kind of like, I feel like that, I have savings, but part of me is like, why just keep it in a savings account?
This is for you. This is for you. Forget about the savings rate, and here's why. So this is a paper that was published end of last year. I interviewed one of the authors. Her name's Preet Banerjee, and they looked at emergency funds and retirement savings and how people access them in emergencies. And here's what they found. They basically said this has to do with mental accounting. If you had an emergency, and let's say you had $1 million RSP, and the example that Dr. Madron gave me was, let's say your fridge conks out and it's a $1,000 fridge. And you don't have a dedicated emergency fund for paying for something like that. It's a totally unexpected cost. You might say, oh, well, I've got $1 million in my investment account. I'll just pull from there. And because you're pulling from this great big pool of money, you're thinking, well, I could take out $1,000 and replace the exact same fridge that I have, which has been doing perfectly fine for the last 10 years. Or I could spend $2,000 and get a really fancy fridge, because look at all that money that's sitting there. $2,000 out of this $1 million, not a big deal. And so you have a tendency to spend more than you would need to if you're accessing it for something that wasn't dedicated as an emergency fund. So remember, cash is harder. It's more painful to spend than credit. And when you're pulling from a big pool versus a small pool, it's very easy to pull from a big pool and pull too much. So people tend to pull out too much from other sources of funds when they are relying on a non-emergency fund as a source of emergency funds. And if you're thinking about, well, I'll just rely on a line of credit, again, it's way easier to spend credit than it is to spend cash, right? Spending cash is painful. So one of my friends, Dr. Avni Shah, she talks about the inspiration behind her research, which is looking at the pain of payment. And she talks about the story where every day she would go to a coffee shop and she'd pay with plastic. And one day she forgot her wallet and she only had cash. And so she paid with cash, and she noticed that it hurt more to part with physical cash. But she also noticed that the coffee tasted better. Like, there's a lot of psychological implications about the method of payment and how we perceive what we bought. We tend to be happier with things that we've bought when we pay with them with cash versus credit. So yeah, there's a lot going on there, but the advice seems to be very clear to me. If you set up a dedicated emergency fund, then when you have an emergency, you're going to be much more efficient with how you spend those emergency funds. You will spend only what you need to cover off the actual emergency. You're less tempted to be inefficient with your spending and pull more money than you need to, whether it be from retirement savings or some other investment account or some other source of funds, or if you're accessing credit, because we tend to spend credit more freely than we do cash because it doesn't hurt as much to spend credit because it doesn't feel as real.
That's interesting. I mean, I will confess, I did a long time ago start taking this idea of paying cash because I noticed it even in myself. You know, if you're paying cash, you burn through $300-400 a week. You're like, where did all this money go?
Yeah.
Whereas when it's on credit, you don't notice that you just burn through, you know, $300-400 a week on nothing.
Yeah. And it has to, there's another component, which is the saliency. So think about how we pay for things today with tap to pay or paying with plastic. You pull out a plastic card and you tap, the card never leaves your hand. Whereas if you pay with cash, you pull out bills, right? And you give a bill, it has to leave your hand and then something different comes back, maybe some coins or whatever. So qualitatively, it just feels a lot different. So it's more painful to do that, whereas with tapping, you can tap all day long and it just doesn't feel the same. Also, when you're paying with a credit card, those transactions become diffuse because you don't really tie the balance specifically to those individual transactions. They all get lost.
Yeah.
Whereas with an individual transaction, it's more connected. So when you get your bill, most people don't even look at all those transactions. They don't even realize where they've been spending their money. So they're less connected to their spending as well. So the psychology of money is really very interesting. My original schooling was in neuroscience, and that's always stayed with me, even in the money world.
It's funny. I mean, as you're saying this, I find even for myself, if I go buy a coffee and it costs me just over $5 and I'm left with $4 and something and change, I round up to the next bill. And like in my head, I feel like that just cost me $10 because I don't like the change, right?
Yeah.
The change is nothing. Like you just throw it in a drawer.
Right.
So it's kind of funny how we do kind of do these sort of mental things in our head that just kind of influences, I think, how we spend money. That's really fascinating.
So I think to solve this, when it comes to how do we actually set up these emergency funds in the future, one is set up a dedicated savings account where you can put money into and then automate it. So we know that automating these decisions and tasks is very effective. For the same way that we have subscription creep and we seem to lose track of how those expenses have built up over time, if you automate your savings, this is so powerful because you don't have to think about making that trade-off every month. Like, how much should I save this much? How much should I save this month? Because that requires some willpower, and there's only so much willpower that we have. And the more trade-off decisions we make, the less optimal our decisions tend to become. So for example, you know, at the beginning of every year, when people want to get into better shape, they will exercise and try to eat better. And so they'll spend an hour on a treadmill, which takes a lot of willpower to stay on there for an hour. And then right after that workout, they're much more likely to eat junk food because they're out of willpower, right? So their ability to make good decisions goes down the more we exercise our willpower. Yeah. And so if you constantly have to think about how much should I save this month? How much should I save this month? Your decision optimality goes down. So if you can automate that and remove the decision-making process and just have it happen in the background, it's going to be very effective. And when I was an advisor, my most successful clients, the ones who had the most money and the most complete financial picture, there was very little correlation to their knowledge about investment markets, It was when I asked them, what's been the single biggest determinant for your financial success, how much you have in these accounts? And they said, I just automated my savings, and I've been doing that for a long time. That's literally it.
Yeah.
So just making things automatic is so effective. And I know it's tired, old, true advice, but the reason it is because it works.
Yeah, 100%. And I think not everyone does it, and I do agree with you. I mean, it works as well as we mentioned at the top of this discussion, the subscriptions that are automated that come out of our account, we don't notice them. And exactly the same way you don't really notice kind of the savings once it's kind of automated and just part of your system.
Can you imagine if, for example, like your home internet, cable, if you have it, and cell phone, if every month they asked you, do you still want to pay $170 a month for this? Do you still want to pay $170 a month for this? Your behaviors would probably change.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. That's hilarious. One thing I want to ask you, and something we talked about earlier, is sort of one of these risks that kind of mitigate disaster proofing that's not in your book because it's kind of a little bit more recent. This idea of cyber risks, which I think a lot of people don't really think about when they're accessing banking around the world and traveling, that I think is kind of worth kind of hearing about and talking about.
Yeah, and I know we had chatted before about the pandemic, and I had mentioned that it's not really a black swan event because black swans are not supposed to be predictable, right? So there's kind of like three sort of criteria of a black swan. One of them is that it was not predictable. Well, a lot of epidemiologists around the world have been saying for a while, hey, listen, one of the biggest risks to our way of life and the world in general is a pandemic. And of course, people downplayed it and downplayed it and downplayed it. Of course, now we have this pandemic and we realize how salient that advice was. And I think it's the same with cybersecurity and the risks that we are exposed to on a regular basis. As more and more of our life is electronic and so much of our identity is online, it is, in my mind, just a matter of time before we have a significant enough of event that a lot of people are going to be thrown into disaster mode. So it could be, it could be a state-sponsored cyber attack. It could be some, independent hacker group. It could be the downing of a power grid. You name it. Everything is done online. If I asked if you go back to, do you remember the big power outage in North America? I think it was early 2000s, maybe 2003, something like that. I remember thinking, if I needed to buy more stuff, if this keeps on going on like it is, where would I actually get the money to pay for this stuff? Like when you look at physical currency versus all the money that people have attached to their name, of all the money you've ever earned, all the money that you have in your net worth, how much of it is in, dollar bills? Like nothing, like as a percentage, it's like very little. It's all electronic. Yeah. And so this presents a very big risk. And I think, again, we should go back to thinking about what we can do to mitigate it as best as we can. And that is doing the simple things that we're told over and over again to do, but we don't do, which is cover your PIN if you're entering your PIN number. No one covers their PIN. Yeah. Maybe it's getting those little protective sleeves for your cards, because now with tap to pay, there's this video I saw of a security consultant saying, look how easy it is to steal money from people. And he just carried around a point of sale terminal and put in a certain amount and just waved it by people's butts. And eventually there'd be a near field chip enabled card in someone's wallet close enough to the terminal that he could just take $50 out of thin air, basically, by waving this terminal by your butt in a crowded, subway station or whatever. Yeah, that's a thing. So, when it comes to cybersecurity and how we think about not only our financial transaction, but all transactions online, we have to take it a lot more seriously. So one thing that I recommend for people is have a separate credit card for internet purchases. Mm-hmm. And this could be a card with a low limit, $1,000 or whatever, and it's only used for purchasing things online, and you don't use it otherwise. Because when you make a transaction online, it just seems like it'd be much more exposed going through, the different data circuits and what have you, than carrying it in your wallet. But carrying in your wallet also has risks. So, get
Yeah.
those sleeves for your cards, or get a purse or wallet that has that shielding so that people can't tap to pay when you're not trying to pay for anything.
Yeah. That's funny. I mean, one thing I've also kind of always have been anxious with is accessing online banking while I'm traveling, and not so much on my cell phone, but even on my laptop. Like, unless I'm on some sort of secure network or something, I'm not walking into a Starbucks in, like, anywhere on a public Wi-Fi. And it's one of those things I've always been uneasy doing, banking online when I'm kind of traveling, and for those reasons.
Yeah, and you definitely don't want to use an unsecured network when you're accessing your financial information. I would personally use a laptop over a mobile device when accessing your account, especially
Oh,
over a
really?
Wi-Fi network. Yeah, other things that we should make sure that we're doing is making sure that anytime we're making transactions or providing information, that you have the
I see.
HTTPS for the secure, so that's encrypted. And even then, you still want to be careful. Like, I really only check my online banking at home.
Hmm.
And I really don't see much reason to check it, on the road while traveling. But obviously, there are times when you need to make transactions or take a look at data. But make sure that you're following all the safety protocols, and ensuring that you do that makes it more likely that you have protection from your financial service provider as well.
Yeah.
There's so many times you've heard of people who have said, "Hey, I got, someone, I'm a victim of fraud." They make a claim, and then the institution says, "Well, did you follow the protocols that are listed and all this stuff?" They say, "Well, no, I didn't." "Well, then we don't cover you."
Yeah.
So, everyone has to play their part.
Yeah.
Certainly, sometimes institutions have to step up a little bit more, but people also have to step up and make sure that they are taking the steps to transact safely online, because it is, again, just a matter of time before there's some kind of attack. And some people may be subject to that because they just use the same password for everything. It still happens today.
Yeah.
Like, you see all those lists of 2020's top 10 passwords. It's still 1 2 3 4 is like always going to be number one. So it's crazy. You got to change your passwords, use different passwords for different sites. You got to take this
Yeah.
stuff way more seriously.
Awesome. I want to be respectful of your time. We got about another 5 minutes left. Is there anything kind of you wanted to sort of touch on that we didn't go over? I mean, I know there's more kind of tips in your book. Anything specifically you kind of just want to leave our viewers with?
Just a thought that I've been noodling for the last little while, and I think it's in response to this pandemic. I think people are realizing that what is valuable to them may
Hmm.
be different than what they thought pre-pandemic versus, I wouldn't say post-pandemic, because we're going to be in this for a while.
Hmm.
But because there's been sort of a forced lockdown, certain things you can't buy, I think we're finding that there are different priorities that we have, what's truly important to us. And so I think it is important to maybe reevaluate what our priorities are. And a good exercise is to, write down what your priorities are and then compare them to how you spend your money. And if there's a divergence between how you're spending your money, whether or not they're in furthering achieving of those priorities or goals, that tells you that those maybe aren't your actual priorities. You would like to think that those are your priorities, but if you want to know what people's priorities are, see how they spend their money today, right? It's a kind of a famous saying. And so take a look and see, is there a divergence between how you spend your money and what is truly important to you? And I think that is an excellent exercise for people to go through now, as well as when we get to some semblance of normal. It's important to be mindful about how we spend our money.
That's awesome. Great. I agree. 100% great suggestion. Thanks so much. I'm going to wrap up with two quick questions that we're asking all of our speakers.
Uh-oh.
So the first one is, the theme of our conference is smart caution. So What does that mean to you?
Smart caution. Well, that's good because I feel like that encapsulates how similar to you, I kind of live in this worst case scenario mindset. Like I always think about what could go wrong. And when it comes to making choices, I tend to focus on with choice A, what's the worst case scenario? Choice B, what's the worst case scenario? And which would I hate most? And then I just do the other, right? So I focus more on the losses for sure when it comes to making decisions and choices. And I think that's smart. I think that it is smart to evaluate the risks with all the various outcomes that you're considering and focus more on what you would hate the most and then avoid that. I find that when people are on the fence about certain things, that is a great way of looking at things.
Yeah, that's smart. And it is funny. I do the exact same thing. I think a lot of people do not think about. They don't think about all the risks, and they don't think about kind of the ones they might hate the most. I think that's a great advice. And our last question, of course, being a real estate centered focus kind of conference, is: would you buy or sell a home right now?
Oh, good question. So I don't think I would buy a home right now. But again, that's more of a personal decision because I don't know where I'm going to be. And I'm a big believer that you need to be reasonably sure that you're going to be in one place for 10 years plus if you're thinking about buying, especially when you've got a city or a neighborhood where prices are quite a bit higher than, say, the national average. You really got to make sure. And you also have to have a big buffer. I find a lot of people, they're anxious to buy, but they don't have enough buffer in their finances post-transaction. And then they're just basically guaranteeing they're walking this knife's edge for a long time. I think it's a bad place to be in stress-wise. And of course, we see that if anything happens, it can upend your entire world. So when it comes to buying and selling, I don't really think of it in terms of timing. I think of it is, am I ready or is the person ready to make a long-term commitment? And after they make that commitment, are they able to also save a retirement, have an emergency fund? Then you're good. Then I would just tune out the market, and your home is your home. It's a place where you live, and just tune that out and get on with your life.
That's fantastic advice. Preet, thank you so much for taking time today. I really appreciate it. I'm sure our viewers are enjoying this and got a lot of value out of your feedback today. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me, John. It's been my pleasure.